My recent video about choosing a new air compressor ended on a bit of a cliffhanger as I wasn't sure which one to buy out of the Hyundai 50 litre and the Abac Monte Carlo 50 litre. I'll link to that video in the description box below if you haven't seen it. Anyway, I got a lot of comments recommending that I bought the Abac Monte Carlo, so that's what I went for in the end, and it came with a free pallet. So I got it unboxed, I put the wheels on, and then I can get it into the workshop and have a closer look at it. And just to be clear, the air compressor and the spray gun featured in this video I paid for with my own money. So I've just seen a sticker on the side of the body which I think indicates that this is 85 decibels. I thought I'd bought a silent compressor. That's actually not too noisy at all. It's certainly not 85 decibels, but it's not as quiet as my old compressor. According to the app on my phone, I was getting readings of about 70 decibels at a 1 meter distance. The website states 59 decibels SPL. The label indicates 85 decibels LWA. Meanwhile, the manual states 79 decibels LWA, and I measured 70 decibels at 1 meter. I don't get what any of that means, but who cares? The important thing is that it's not too loud, so I'm happy. In terms of first impressions, this thing oozes quality. I've always said that you can tell a lot about the quality of the tool by the quality of the electrical cable it comes with. And this cable is really thick and rubberized, it just feels expensive. All of the switches and knobs work as they should, which is more than can be said for my last compressor, so I'm really happy so far. It's not all good news though, and after having a quick flick through the manual, the recommendation is to leave 50 centimeters of space either side and at the back of this compressor. The body of this measures 30 centimeters, so if you add that on to 50 centimeters either side, that's 1.3 meters in width. The length of the body is 80 centimeters, so add 50 to that, and that's another 1.3 meters. Who on earth has that amount of workspace to be able to accommodate that kind of a footprint? This over here is the space that I had in mind for storing my new compressor to replace my old compressor, and while it'll fit physically, obviously it's far from ideal. So I guess what I'll have to do every time I use the compressor is bring it out like that so that there's space around it. I mentioned in the choosing a compressor video that a higher CFM rating was one of the most important features for me, as I'm going to be using the air compressor mainly for spraying. The Abac is rated at 8.1 CFM, but that's what's called a displacement rating and isn't actually representative of what the compressor is capable of outputting, and that's a dodgy marketing trick that all of the compressor manufacturers seem to have adopted. After reading up on it a bit, the actual CFM the compressor is likely to be able to deliver is around 2/3 of that displacement rating, so for this compressor it's likely to be more like 5.4 CFM output. So that's the compressor. Now onto the spray gun. First, I borrowed a few LVLP spray guns from my uncle, ranging from expensive ones like this SATA Jet, through to the mid-range like this ANI Astra, and then the cheap like this Parkside. And I got on pretty well with all three of them, to be honest, so I was pretty certain that LVLP was the system for me, mainly because they work well with a lower CFM output. Most of the spray guns I looked at had a recommended minimum output of between 4 and 6 CFM, which means that they can be used with the smaller tank compressors like the 50 litre one I just bought. LVLP also apparently generates less overspray when compared with HVLP, which is good because sometimes I'm going to want to spray inside my workshop. But LVLP was not actually what I ended up getting, because I sent an email asking for some advice to a company called Spray Guns Direct, and they recommended something called a MIDI spray gun, the ANI R160, which only requires 3.6 CFM. So I took that recommendation and bought that along with an inline regulator for controlling the air supply to the gun, and the total cost was around £123, including VAT. This is a gravity-fed gun with a 1.2mm nozzle. I wrapped some PTFE tape around to get a good seal, and then I can get the regulator fitted. So now I need something to spray. Fortunately, I have a door that needs painting, and as it's bigger than anything I'm likely to ever want to spray in the workshop anyway, this should be a good test to see how my air compressor copes. I get all of the old hardware removed and fill the holes, and I plug the biggest hole with a dowel. As the old finish has quite a shine to it, I needed to get it sanded down so that the new paint will adhere, so I sanded at 80 grit, followed by 120. I used a detail sanding pad in the oscillating multi-tool to get into the smaller panels, and I did all of the beadings by hand. After blowing away all of the dust from sanding, I can mix up some paint. I'm using a bit of water to mix in with some acrylic primer just to thin it a little. I didn't measure any quantities. I'm keen to try and get a natural feel for what kind of paint viscosity will work. I ended up with a mix that looked like this. If I were to guess, I would say it was probably 6 parts paint to 1 part water maybe. I have some disposable paint filters to filter out any bits. And then I can set up the gun, and I need to set the regulator to 29 psi, which is just under 2 bar, and I set the airflow on the gun to maximum. Then I can set the fan size, and I was surprised at how big the fan pattern was on its maximum setting, but I didn't want it quite that big, so I dialed it down a bit. In terms of fan pattern, if you're spraying something thin, you can make it smaller, but you may need to dial down the air a little. If you're spraying something big, you can obviously go wider, but not too big. You want to maintain a nice, evenly distributed elliptical pattern of paint. If it looks a bit like a figure of 8, then that means that the air is too high. And you can adjust the fan pattern to either vertical, horizontal, or diagonal using the front cap, depending on what you're spraying. And then I start spraying, starting with the edges. Although I missed a bit here for some reason, but don't worry, I'll get that later. And then onto the faces. It covered quite well for a first coat of primer, and I can leave it in the sun to dry. Once it was dry, I applied a second coat of filler. The paint helps to highlight any low spots, as filler tends to shrink a little bit. And then while that dries, I can flip the door over and work on the other side. And there's something to point out here. You might spot a little piece of plastic on the front of the spray gun flailing around. I don't know what it was or where it came from, and I only noticed it and removed it after I'd finished spraying. Fortunately for me though, whatever it was didn't seem to affect the spray pattern. And when that's dry, I can flip it over and sand the second coat of filler nice and flush. I'm using some water-based satin paint as a top coat. This is just cheap stuff. It's not particularly good quality, but I had it, so I'm using it. And it was spitting with rain, so I bought the door inside the workshop this time, which I thought would be interesting because I want to find out if overspray is going to be an issue. Hopefully, I won't find all of my tools covered in paint dust once I'm done. These doors are old, they're from the 1930s, and they have some small cracks in them. I probably should have filled those with filler too, but hopefully after a few coats of paint they should disappear. I opened both of my doors and set up a fan to blow the air around, which will help the paint dry quickly. And after that I gave the door another 2 coats of paint. And it came out pretty good, so now I can get the door hung again. And proof as if it were needed that no job is ever straightforward. These screws are way too loose in the holes, and I don't have any wider screws to use, so I'm going to need to plug these holes with some dowels. Then I can drill new pilot holes and get some new screws in. To wrap up the video, I wanted to talk about what I've learned from this experience for anyone else looking to get into spraying. Firstly, overspray. Obviously not an issue outdoors, as most of it just gets carried away by the wind. I did have a very small amount of white paint dust on the concrete floor outside, which I can't show you at the moment because it's covered in snow. It's not anything I'm worried about though. It was barely noticeable really, and it'll get worn away pretty quickly anyway, but it's a good idea to put a dust sheet down. When it came to spraying inside the workshop, there was a lot of overspray hanging around in the air. You definitely need to use a respirator with filters suitable for paint particles, even if using water-based finishes like I was. You also definitely want as much ventilation in the workshop as possible. I opened both of my doors. My windows unfortunately don't open. I'm actually going to get them replaced at some point in future, and that will enable me to get better airflow through the space, which will help things dry quicker and help shift the overspray. I didn't really notice any paint particles on any of my tools or work surface in the workshop though, so that's really good. That was one of my main concerns. There probably was some overspray dust on the floor, as there was when I sprayed outside, but my floor has so much sawdust on it that I couldn't see it. And as it's a workshop, I don't really care about getting stuff on my floor anyway. I'm not one of those people that have to have a workshop so clean that you can eat food off your work surfaces. I did put a dust sheet down over my workbench though, just to keep that clean. So if you have a workspace a similar size to mine, which by the way is about 6 meters by 5.5 meters and 2.7 meters high, and if you use similar equipment to me, my advice would be don't worry too much about overspray unless you're obsessed with keeping it spotlessly clean. Now onto how well did the compressor keep up with my spraying. It was absolutely fine. If you're going to be spraying items larger than a door, like a car for example, then maybe you might need a larger compressor or higher CFM. But for me, I'm mostly going to be spraying smaller items, and it kept up with my spraying perfectly well on the door. I think it fired up and recharged maybe 3 times while I was spraying 4 edges and 1 face of the door, but I didn't notice any drop in performance, so that's good. And I'm generally really happy with my choice of compressor. Also really happy with the spray gun, works great for me. I don't have loads of experience with other spray guns to compare it to though, so take what I'm saying with a pinch of salt. But it does seem to be well regarded by others too, so that gives me some reassurance. A little about cleaning the spray gun. It's pretty easy with water-based finishes. I just sprayed some clean water through it once I was done with spraying to flush out all of the paint, and then washed it out using the supplied brushes to clean the nozzle, which just unscrews from the front. I also removed the needle and cleaned that, and apparently it's a good idea to put a little grease on the needle too, just to keep it moving smoothly, so I just used some Vaseline for that. I didn't clean the gun in between coats of paint. I know some people probably do, and water-based finishes do tend to dry quite quickly, but when I googled it, most people said it'll be fine, and it was fine, so that's good. You should only really be spraying on thin coats each time anyway, and it's pretty much dry within an hour at the most, ready for the next coat. If it was going to be several hours before I could get the next coat on, then I probably would clean it out properly. Lastly, I just wanted to share something with you that my uncle, who worked in a spray shop for many years, told me, which is one of the main reasons I wanted to get into spraying in the first place. These spray cans, which you might have seen me use in previous videos, apparently contain very little paint. Apparently they only have about this much paint inside, and the rest of the can is filled with propellant. Now that might be obvious to some people, but for me it was something I'd never really thought about, and spray cans are expensive, ranging in price from maybe £5 to £15 per can. If you buy it in bulk, which is what I used to do, you can get it much cheaper than that, but when you think about it, it's still incredibly expensive when you're paying for such a tiny amount of paint. And often you're using multiple of those cans of paint just to spray one project. For me, I'd much rather buy a tin of paint or varnish for between £10 and £30 and get like 2.5 litres of the stuff, and use my own propellant in the form of compressed air, because you get a lot more for your money. Also, you're not spending ages shaking up a can each time you want to spray something, and sometimes the nozzles on those cans don't work all that well either. If you're a DIYer spraying the odd project, then spray cans absolutely have a place, but for anyone who's spraying things regularly, it makes a lot more sense to get into spraying using a spray gun and compressor, I think. Plus, it's quicker, you can adjust your fan pattern according to what you're spraying, and it gives a great finish. So that was my experience getting into spraying, and please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, if you want to see me do more of it in future videos. And if you have more experience at this stuff than me, which wouldn't be hard, and you want to give some advice to me or others reading, please do so in the comments section below. So that's it for this one. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can find links down below to donate on PayPal, or you can sign up for Patreon or YouTube channel membership and receive early access to my videos, exclusive content, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.